This is fantastic. I'm loving this turnout. My name is Greg Atkins. I am an assistant professor in the history department here. I want to give a special thanks to Madison Albers, Miriam Benavides Ortega, Dr. Daryl Hamlin, Dr. Shin Yin Yang, and the American Democracy Project here. The American Democracy Project does so much to bring kind of civil discussions to Fort Hays, and I'm just so appreciative. You're doing a great job. Now that they have an office on the third floor, I occasionally get to see you a little more often, so that's great too. I titled this talk Free Market Faith because I and many other scholars and commentators of U.S. religion, we argue that the history of the nation's kind of tempestuous religious marketplace provides important context for understanding the current political moment, and I'm trying to aim to, look at that in particular with this presentation. A couple of years ago, right before Christmas, Ross Douthat wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, which is where I'm, taking this Time Talks from. He reflected on the 10-year anniversary of his book, Bad Religion. He's a conservative Christian, kind of interesting. He was Pentecostal, become Catholic. He became the youngest regular op-ed writer for the New York Times at 29, when he replaced their kind of conservative talkhead Bill Kristol as kind of that conservative voice for the New York Times. He argued in Bad Religion, his argument in The Americanization of Religion, that article that he wrote as an op-ed, he revisits this argument from Bad Religion, his book. He argues that America wasn't becoming more atheistic, it was becoming more heretical. That's the argument of his book, and then he's kind of revisiting that idea in this 2022 op-ed. He points to personalized versions of Christianity, but personalized versions of all kinds of religions that had won against what he called, quote, connection to historical Christian orthodoxies, end quote, and church attendance. And that's for him, for Douthat. Modern individualist prophetesses and prophets like Joel Osteen, Oprah Winfrey, Dan Brown of the Da Vinci Code fame, Elizabeth Gilbert of Eat, Pray, Love, Will I Am of the Yes We Can Obama song, Glenn Beck of Reflecting Honor and that whole rally series. He said that all these kind of perpetuate these heresies in the United States. And he says that these movements explain more about religion in America than things like the Southern Baptist Convention or the Catholic Church or the Nicene Creed or the New Testament, kind of these doctrinal things that people go back to. This is all Douthat in his argument that's heresy kind of driving all this. He also kind of points to Trump as being the heir to all of this. President Trump kind of embodies a lot of this move away from institutional kind of orthodoxies to this hodgepodge of all things religion, especially though maybe prosperity gospel, self-help religion, and this kind of very nationalistic Christianity kind of all coming together in the person of President Donald Trump. So looking over those years from 2012 to 2022, Douthat kind of casts Trump as that heir to all these things. Meanwhile, for Douthat, the progressive side of things is also kind of has its own quote-unquote bad religion happening for him. Campus activism, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, DEI. He calls all those things the Great Awakening. A throwback to Great Awakening for him, where, quote, Christian spiritual energies cut loose from Orthodox belief for him. As a sort of neo-Puritanism, social justice progressives demanded moral perfectionism on particular social issues, or that's how Douthat sees it. So out of that crucible of 2012 to 2022, for Douthat, the social gospel progressives' impulse is so watered down a Christianity that he calls it a post-Christian reality. And then conservatives for him are subscribing to, quote, Christianity as a cultural marker for Americanness than to actual attending church, end quote. And social media kind of causing a change up of all of this. And increasingly bringing younger crowds into it as well as things like astrology, witchcraft, spiritualism, and the hallucinogenic quest, he says. So it's just kind of a rampant atomization of religion for Douthat, but he's seeing it as much more a heretical thing that's happening. He concludes the U.S. not only is more post-Christian than ever, but perhaps more in need of authentic Christianity and in mystery and second chances more than ever. That's Douthat. I mean, he's a Catholic. He's trying to turn this around into what he wants as well. There's his book, Bad Religion. So I respectfully am going to disagree with a lot of what Douthat points out here, and I'll flesh that out. The history of religion in the United States is replete with people like Douthat and other doomsayers that condemn the religious moment and spirituality of their age as particularly heretical. In the 1600s, Puritanism versus things like Baptists and Methodists, it was all pointing fingers that this is heretical. Basically, all Christian denominations versus Quakers in that same century. Most Christian denominations would distance themselves from Quakers that they saw as heretical. The 1790s, in native religion, you've got the Seneca Longhouse religion versus the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace religion. So it's not even just Christianity. In the United States, this is happening a lot. 1800s, most established organizations, religious organizations against the Latter-day Saints movement. Preachers labeling New Ageism of the 1970s as particularly heretical for them, and now Douthat with this current, moved away from institutional religion as being, again, specifically very heretical. So what is going on? If I disagree about why, then what is going on here in the last 10, 15 years? A year after Douthat published The Americanization of Religion in the New York Times, I was at San Francisco attending the American Society of Church History. And this is kind of a long-running professional organization. It's founded in 1888 to use critical social science approaches instead of theology to study Christianity and ecclesiastical history. So it's got a very broad umbrella. I'll give you a really quick personal story about subscribing to the Journal of Church History and being a part of this organization. At Washington State, as I was doing my graduate work, I had a copy of church history on my desk. It had just come in, and I was going to look at it and see if I knew anybody or what was in that recent issue. One of the professors walked by my desk going to his office, and then he stopped and he backed up and he said, "Is that church history?" And I said, "Yeah, that's the most recent version of church history." And another one of our colleagues at Washington State had just published in church history. She published an article about Christianity in Japan. And I thought he was thinking, hey, that's probably church history with her article in it. And so I thought he was going to ask to borrow it. And he said, "Well, can I borrow that?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." He's like, "Because we're out of toilet paper in the men's bathroom and we need something." So he, quite like a diehard atheist, and he just saw church history and kind of had that knee-jerk reaction. I thought he was thinking about this article that another person had published. But it is a journal that has a wide reach, and all kinds of people publish in it is what I'm trying to get at. I find myself at the ASCH meeting in, this would be January of 2023. I ran into a longtime colleague, Will Schultz there. He's at the University of Chicago now. Evangelicals' persistent high-level support of Donald Trump had made a cottage industry of studying religion and evangelicalism, and that was the cornerstone of Will and I's shared research interest. So we felt, as we were talking, that maybe the whole discussion needed some help thinking back to some of the classics that we returned to that existed long before this cottage industry kind of rises up. So we were talking about, hey, what are these classic, pieces that still influence our research today? And we agreed that R. Lawrence Moore's 1994 Selling God especially deserved a renaissance. 2024 was the 30th anniversary of that book. And so Moore retired from Cornell in 2012, but he agreed to be on the round table with us. So scholars joined Will and I, scholars from Harvard, Brown, the University of the South. We all wanted to, and we all met up at the ASCH that next year. So just January 2024, or 2025, I'm sorry. So that was January 2024. January 2025, we all put a round table together and we met and talked about this book. And I think this offers a much better framework for understanding what's going on than Douthat or any kind of heretical versus atheistic framework. That just doesn't seem to resonate so well with us on that panel either. Moore wrote that as a pushback in the 1980s and 90s to what he was seeing at the time, a lot of commentators being very presentist about Jim Bakker, about all these televangelists, and they're writing these kind of knee-jerk reactions about, hey, this isn't how religion has ever worked in the United States. This is a new way of looking at religion. And he's saying in Selling God, no, religion has always kind of had some of these elements in it in the United States, and then fleshes that out. So against that kind of, hey, this is heretical Christianity, he's pushing back to say, no, that always was kind of true in the United States. Those heretical beliefs in kind of like positive thinking, religious nationalism, feel-good, new age beliefs, social gospel, all of those have very long histories. They're not recent at all. And he points that out in Selling God as well. But he's pushing back, along with others, with a bold new argument that shortly after the passage of the First Amendment in the United States, religion began to operate as a commodified form of entertainment. And it competed in this unregulated marketplace with other religions and other forms of leisure, and it always had to carve out a space for itself, but it always had a space for itself in the United States. Outlawing federal support of a particular religion had actually a paradoxical effect. In the 1780s and 90s, U.S. citizens had little association with institutional religion. About 17% of people in the United States attended church frequently, meaning about once a week. So 17%. That's lower than even today. Gallup says today it's about 30%, down from a high in 2005 of 42%. People like Thomas Jefferson thought that the disestablishment of religion would see religion disappear in 40 or 50 years. Like without state support, religion would just go away. But the paradox is it had the opposite effect in the United States. Thanks to that hyper-religious marketplace of the Great Awakening, frequent church attendance ballooned from 17% in 1790 to 34% by 1850. Meanwhile, attending religious services in Europe plummeted. This was not because America was especially more pious, but much more because the United States was a place where religion and spirituality were unregulated and could tap into that unregulated marketplace of entertainment. People didn't attend church because the national government encouraged it. So unlike in Europe, religious organizations were in the marketplace competing for attention, competing for resources, legitimacy, converts against other religious organizations, but other leisure activities as well. And they found great ways to do that. That's kind of the genius of this book. It really points out how that happens. So he looks at the Second Great Awakening and how it includes slick marketing and attractions. Entertaining revivals might include prospective converts sitting in what was called the anxious seat and talking at length and in detail about their sins. And if you were, lucky enough to be this close, you're not only edified to say, oh, now this person's becoming Christian, you might also be there being like, tell me a little more about the kind of sin that you're involved in. So it's got elements that both draw people who are interested in becoming Christian, but also elements of entertainment that might draw more lurid kind of fascinations. Revivals also had this carnival-like atmosphere, people selling food and drink in concession stands. Christian publishing was booming. He spends a lot of time looking at that. Some of the most popular books, he points out, include sexual details that are very graphic for the time, but quote-unquote necessary to keep people from sinning. So again, it's this double-edged sword. Religion operated as entertainment while confirming morality while also being titillating. There was something for people with convictions, but there was also a lot for people without convictions too. Moore traces that religious marketplace to the televangelist he starts with, commenting that the opulence, the chicanery, the scandal of like Jim Baker, who in 1987 finally admitted to sleeping with the 21-year-old church secretary Jessica Hahn. She argued that he raped her, and that never actually goes very far, sadly. And in a more recent kind of example, Jerry Falwell Jr., the president until 2020 of Liberty University, was found to have been in a relationship with his wife and a 21-year-old pool assistant named Giancarlo Granda from 2012 to 2018. He resigns in 2020 over that scandal. But this has a very long arc, according to Selling God, that you can't just take Christianity for the people it's bringing in for this morality, but you also have to understand it also has the scandalous, titillating side to it in the United States, at least. So Douthat, Moore, and I, as well as most scholars of religion, we all agree on some fundamentals, and then we disagree on some. Those fundamentals are people in the U.S. are affiliating less with institutional religion. But they're often maintaining a broad range of religious and spiritual beliefs. Thus, many people are identifying with religions while never darkening the door of a church or a mosque or a synagogue or a temple or any religious organization. This trend has continued through most of my lifetime, but COVID really accelerates this trend. It's pretty amazing. Religious and spiritual beliefs have become more intensely politicized by the left and right as well as this trend has happened. So on the right, people point to verses telling others to obey the law. They castigate those immigrating illegally. I just jumped on the web and I found these in 2 minutes. On the left, people are arguing that Jesus was a colonized immigrant whose heart was for the displaced. So in that marketplace of U.S. religion and spirituality, individualized beliefs with little to no institutional context are hot commodities, and they're continuing to grow at a very rapid pace. But it's not a recent trend. Even though it is more accelerated, it's not recent. Whether through institutions or not, innovation, mixture, commercialization, those have driven the U.S. religious market really since the First Amendment was passed. That atomization is fueling political polarization today, but the marketplace has often polarized politics. Denominations dividing over abolition and slavery, fundamentalism versus modernism, the culture wars. So this has all kind of been true for a very long time, and it has a long history that you can look back to. So let me try to wrap all this up. I've kind of been all over the place. As Robert Putnam famously pointed out 25 years ago in his book, Bowling Alone, community ties at the local level have long been fraying. People's institutional affiliation with religion and spirituality has frayed as well, and those two correspond quite closely. This has allowed people to more freely subscribe to the salad bar of beliefs in more and more creative ways, divorced from institutional guidance, and often from other larger contexts as well. So Douthat recognizes this trend in his Americanization of Religion article in the New York Times, but there are many historical periods where it happens. He's too focused on now and seeing it as too divorced from the past. To call the recent moment especially heretical ignores how this process has always informed religion in the United States, and that's both mainstream and fringe. Many religions claim a true, continuous, unchanging tradition, sometimes over thousands of years, but close historical analysis shows that religion changes in similar fashions to other social movements. Better to look at the religious marketplace as a whole, and how it's changed and the trends that have shaped those changes. The shift away from institutionalization primarily means a loss of the local context where people usually translate orthodoxy, which is correct belief, into orthopractice, which is correct walking out or practice of that belief or correct action. Social media, national news, political parties have now become the main sites of both orthodoxy and orthopractice for many who now identify as, say, evangelical or the progressive inheritors of the social gospel. These identities have less and less affiliation with a specific church or temple or synagogue, mosque. Rather, they're cultural categories attached to kind of more nebulous ideas of in-groups and out-groups, and the orthodoxy they believe or reject, and the orthopraxis they walk out or protest. And this has implications for all kinds of scholarship. The foremost in my mind when I was thinking about it were disciplines like political science specifically, sociology, and others that really depend a lot on polling for a lot of the evidence that they gather. Someone who identified as evangelical 50 years ago most often attended an evangelical church, and someone who identified as, say, atheist 50 years ago identified with a group of free thinkers, often local free thinkers who sat together and honed this idea of what an atheist truly was. Over the last decade or so, those labels have broken down. And you start to see this, especially if the polling is robust enough. Quote, evangelicals, people who mark that on polls, they seem to know nothing about the triune nature of God that most evangelical churches espouse. There's very little doctrine. If the polling gets into doctrine, things go south pretty quickly for somebody who identifies as evangelical often. And true atheists will choose that designation, and then again in robust polling, as it comes down to it, they'll say, yeah, I believe in no God, but often they say, yeah, I believe in ghosts or haunted houses, or ideas of all spirituality being a river that flows to one big truth. You're like, what? You marked atheist up here, so what does it mean? So a return to orthodox religion or faith or spirituality as opposed to heretical ones that Douthat is kind of advocating, that's not going to stop the religious free market from polarizing politics or atomizing even more. Furthermore, the loss of the local context for religions and faiths and spiritualities has only really seemed now to translate religion as entertainment, as Moore kind of argues in his book, Selling God. Much more, it's now becoming religion as more radical political positions. That seems to be more of where that's headed. The best way to claim religious atomization and political polarization is to restore local context and connections. That would be the way forward that I see. But that is where I want to start opening up this for discussion and seeing what else other people are kind of seeing. Yeah, Dr. Hammond.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this really well done presentation. We're so lucky to have you at Fort Hays. And we're really lucky with the American Democracy Project that you took the time to put this together and present it. The idea of the free market of religious expression, of course, is grounded in the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. But on the other hand, the First Amendment also contains the Establishment Clause, which traditionally has been interpreted by the courts as requiring a kind of government neutrality when it comes to its engagement and support of any kind of particular religious expression. More recently, however, of course, many Christians have begun to experience this neutrality as a kind of oppression.
Yes.
And so the movement into the courts has now given the Supreme Court itself new opportunities for new interpretations of the Establishment Clause.
Yeah.
So I guess my question for you is the changing perspective on the Establishment Clause really more of a story about where democracy under the Constitution is at today than what's going on with the Free Exercise Clause, because we've always had a free market of expression in the religious matters.
Yeah, and I think traditionally that way that you think about it is those two go hand in hand. That because there's no establishment of religion by the government, you have this marketplace of religion, and yet at least historically, it's very hard to find a time when that was true, when religion was divorced completely from government. They have a very close relationship often. There are blasphemy laws in state statutes all the way through the 1860s and 1870s. There's often, and that's one of the things to consider, is that establishment clause only at first applies to the federal government, and there are state governments that do establish religions for particular denominations generally in their state up through the 1840s, I want to say. So it's always been messy, I guess, but it's becoming messier as it's, I don't know, over the last 10, 15 years. You see a lot of these kind of Christians seeing that neutrality, as you so well put it, as a type of persecution, and then coming into the courts and using freedom of religion to excuse or empower themselves in some way. There was a great thing that just happened, like 3 or 4 weeks ago. There was a guy I think he had a religious group that was called the Satanic Grotto in Topeka, and he said he wanted to perform a black mass in the Capitol building of Kansas. I don't know if any of you watched this. It was really, really interesting. I'm lucky enough to have a couple friends who are Satanists. And it was interesting getting their view of what was happening, because they were very angry about this particular protester. They felt like it was too amateur. So he doesn't do any of the things that typically make for the good theatrics that Satanists usually put together to basically they want to like really showcase, hey, this disestablishment has never happened because I can't come in here and do a black mass. This guy came in by himself. He didn't have any followers kind of keeping everybody at bay, which is part of the problem. And he didn't memorize his black mass. So he had this piece of paper he needed to read off of that people trying to pick out of his hands. And then he got very frustrated and punched one of those people. And then it all descended into kind of this anarchy. I mentioned that whole thing to the showcase of like, hey, the Capitol starts its legislative sessions with prayer. Why can't I come in here and do a black mass? And then Kansas saying, well, we're going to outlaw all religious activity. Well, I think religious services is what they called it in the Capitol. And then the pushback. How divorced are these things? There's a great book called The Myth of Religious Freedom by David Seahat, 2017, I think. And he does a fantastic job of tracing this messy disestablishment of religion throughout U.S. history. And he argues for kind of a trajectory where you have the individual rights people who have divorced things and have succeeded in getting government to distance itself from religion, but then you have what he calls the moral enforcers who occasionally come to power and get their hands on the levers of the government and do things for themselves, but then often they go too far and then the individual rights people come back. He traces this whole kind of thing. It's at its peak in both the 1850s and 1950s. The moral enforcers are the kind of ones that have power the most in those decades, but the swing back, I don't know if that's any help. The engine, though, that's behind a lot of this is that religious marketplace. And insofar as one group succeeds in getting something of a monopoly or at least a coherent group together that it can use as a voting bloc to get its hands back on that power. I think that is happening now, but my question, at least historically, like reading Selling God and reading The Myth of Religious Freedom, is it now to that point where there's going to be another swing back? I see seeds of that even in the headlines today, but I might just be hoping. So yeah, but that's a great question. There's a lot going on there. Yes, Kevin. complicate things for me.
I'm firmly with you on the political economy of American religious history. Not being an American religious historian, but being a different kind of social theorist. I'm also firmly with this very clear kind of dialectic between the Establishment Clause and its various other forms. But what I think we do need to complicate is that the marketplace, if you want to simplify in one way, the marketplace political, economically of 1789 and the marketplace of 2025 are not the same. And the one example I would throw at you and say, let's look at this, is what I might call the symbolic economy of masculinity in American Christianity and how it relates to the frontier. We can look at the excrescences of the Second Great Awakening, as I like to call them. For example, the extraordinary contrast between the expansionist sensibility, the land expansionist sensibility of Anabaptist groups, Mennonites and Amish, and the land expansionist sensibility of Latter-day Saints. Profoundly different in their nationalist approach. Diametrically opposed in their approach to nationalist thinking. Profoundly similar in their lay masculine only clergy and in their land expansionism. I wouldn't say settler colonialism, but we could go there.
Yeah.
And of course, the sort of popular historical take on this is Jesus and John Wayne.
Right.
And I can never pronounce her name. Nobody knows how to pronounce her name. Kristen something.
Dumais.
Yeah.
Cobase Dumais.
Which is a nice, decently historicized take on this flow. Of course, it kind of focuses on that Hollywoodization. That's a 20th century act. So there are a lot of case study moments there in different subcultures of American Christianity, and in ways in which they, for example, take, once again, the LDS, seeing themselves as more American than America, in redefining America Christologically, and then the Anabaptist groups absolutely refusing government service of any kind in their most radical interpretation.
And I think you can see the wax and wane of the influence of those groups too. I think maybe one of the height of that waxing of the apolitical Christian movements was there at the turn of the 20th century. And one of the books my dissertation advisor wrote, it was called American Apocalypse. He's looking at that apocalyptic strain as the theology he sees as most... For him, if you want to know the difference between a fundamentalist or an evangelical and others, you look at the apocalyptic theology. That's the most kind of salient feature. And what's interesting there is, at first, that's all about apolitical. Hey, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. Why would I spend 1 minute doing anything political? This place is going down. Like, I'm getting out of here. But increasingly over the 20th century, it becomes much more attached to a conservative political theory that wants to essentially, it needs its hands back on the levers of government power so that it can navigate through apocalypticism in some way, shape, or form. And it's really so those Anabaptists and the Mennonites that do tend to be more apolitical, they're not on board with that apocalyptic theology, and so they become more estranged and smaller as that apocalyptic theology grabs more and more people and brings them in a political, So,
the LDS theology puts the very
which is
at the
also
beginning of
apocalyptic.
The historicity of the religion.
Yeah. A book, if you ever want to read just a great book on how that happens in Utah, there's a book by Jared Farmer called On Zion's Mount. It's fantastic. He's taking evangelical geography and its theory and kind of welding it onto some historical analysis of that. But there is a masculinity thread to all of that as well. And I think more and more scholarship is coming out in the wake of Dumais and her ability to get on a New York Times bestseller list with an academic book, which, if you know how to do that, let me know. I'd love to. Yeah, Chris.
Thank you for the presentation, Greg. I'm one of the dreaded political scientists at UConn, although I identify as a social scientist. So a lot of political scientists and sociologists, like you say, try to measure the level of religiosity or spirituality over time using that frequency of church attendance measure often used in a lot of survey instruments. But from your perspective, given a lot of the changes that you've seen, if researchers are trying to gauge fluctuations in spirituality over time, what are things that pollsters should ask about to capture the variation in spirituality over time?
I think that's a really good question. And maybe it has to do with the salience of that very framing of church attendance. I don't know how important that is. I think you could move into some polling questions that would move away from that a little more. Because as I'm looking at statistics, the amount of people going weekly to attend a religious service of some kind is tanking, and quickly. But again, the polling does show a pretty steady belief in some sort of kind of spirituality or religious concept. I got into this argument. There was an atheist in my PhD program who came to be a really dear friend, and I had to run a lot of my scholarship by him because I was looking at kind of evangelicalism and its history, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't forgetting anything or have any glaring logical errors. So I'd run it by Robert, and Robert would often give me this fantastic feedback. And but one of the things that he mentioned was like, look at church attendance, it's all going down, and like everybody will become atheists pretty soon. And I'm like, well, when you get into the weeds, the spirituality remains. That I think atheism's ticked up maybe 2 percentage points from 10 maybe to like 13%, something like that, or 10 to 11 maybe. While there's been this change in religion and spirituality that's much more divorced from institutionalization. So I would suggest in the polling having questions about engagement with media that is religious and spiritual in its content. And that media could be anything from attending a church service in person to being on a website about yoga there's so much. And then even that you have to kind of historically changes over time, because somebody who says, well, I'm an atheist, but I go to yoga class, versus people who are like, I go to yoga class because there's a spiritual fulfillment there. It gets really tricky. So maybe being very careful about the way you frame how you've engaged with media or activities that you see as spiritual in their content or something to that effect, to get an idea of engagement, but not necessarily the need to always be, do you go to these services once a week or something like that. I don't know that helps as much anymore, but it's tricky, is what I'm saying.
Do you think that the fluctuations are tied to shifts in macroeconomic trends? Because a lot of that has to do, I think, with a feeling of connectedness and an element of trust. And if the economy does go on a sharp decline, whether or not people feel like religious institutions are something that can be trusted is a valid question, I think. Yeah,
and there is some correlation there that I've seen just studying here and there for 20 years of like that economic decline and then kind of more of an interest or adherence of some kind in spirituality vaguely, as maybe a comfort to the conditions that people are in. But it's interesting too because CEOs of Silicon Valley companies go out to the Arizona desert and eat peyote and sit in sweat lodges, So I'm not quite sure, but it does tend to have an effect on larger groups of people when there are downturns. So yeah, it's always changing and in flux. And then, boys.
Two things. I guess some of them really just ask directly what you believe, sort of polls. And most of those indicate, in my lifetime, a drastic reduction in the number of people who just outright say that they believe in some form of deity. It's over nuns as they get grouped together where you
Right.
have atheists and agnostics, or people who say, it's just not important in my life. It's not like they have any specific philosophical stance on things, just they're doing without, in that sense. They live their lives as if there's no God, and if you ask them, they might say they do, but it doesn't have any impact in how they live their life, how they make their moral decisions, what they do with their lives, and things like this. And then the other thing, which I wanted to touch on, and just first ask whether the individual you cited there, selling and saying, well, look, this isn't a drastic change. There's just the history is interesting. There's too many figures to name, but first of all, de Tocqueville's take on things. Specifically, he came here at a time, what was it, 1835?
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, wow, you don't have a state religion. But it opens things up, and he thought this country was very deeply religious, and that because of that. So he actually saw that then early already. What you were saying is like, well, by letting it be open and not having it enforced, we actually increased it. And what you said about the commodification or the fact that this was entertainment, yeah, Chautauquas,
Right.
the things, they were traveling shows. They had a religious element, but they might be putting on a little portion of the Shakespeare play too.
Yep.
These things were, and they were traveling things to get, multimedia events to the masses. And, you didn't have any other form of entertainment.
Right, there's no radio.
And they didn't even have football.
Right.
So this predates mass sports, so it was the only show in town. It was like the circus comes to town,
Yep.
to us, to a lot of towns. And then you carry that forward, and you get, as pointed out, and he's based it on real research. Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry came out in 1927. He studied preachers, ministers in Kansas City. And a couple
I
of
did not know that.
They were philanderers, and there were people, there's an individual, it's Reverend Bill Stidger, and then a guy named Burchard, who apparently was the one who got caught doing some of this shenanigans. But these people started early in using mass media too.
Very.
And then you go from that where these people get on radio programs. And there was, and even, in Elmer Gantry, you've got Sharon Faulkner. The woman in there, Falconer, is also based on a real woman.
Amy Semple McPherson, I think.
Yes, exactly. That's right. That's a woman. Okay, so we have that. But then you go to Father Conklin, who uses radio like a club.
Right.
And eventually becomes more and more associated with the Nazis. This guy and he's really anti-Semitic, but he had tremendous audience.
Yeah.
His reach was incredibly powerful, and there was a lot of money in it. So radio, and then you move to the televangelists, and actually, Kenneth Copeland, been around for a long time. He actually had a hit song, or released a song. So this guy was in entertainment as well as this, and he transitioned this. Actually saw him in Kansas City early on in his career. It was right out of Elmer Gantry. You had an individual who was a plant in the audience, who was one of the people who worked for him, who later pretended to be crippled and went up to the front, and he got healed. It's like, well, that wasn't too difficult to do. It was a very temporary form of
Elmer Gantry,
handicap that you had because you were walking around just fine earlier. And I was baffled, but did no one else notice this? The same guy who was like serving almost as an usher and things like this. So yeah, those sorts of things have been going on a long time. And I don't think you can say, oh, this is new, or the other individual's book you're pushing back against is like, oh, there's heretical stuff. No, this strain of merging a kind of multimedia event and having it make a lot of money has been there for a long time.
And so I study evangelical organizations. I don't want to run over. I'm good. And one of the things I noticed too is they are on the cutting edge of web development, video editing, all kinds of entertainment. This was true of even Billy Sunday. Corporations were looking at Billy Sunday's revivals and taking notes because he was organized. He was just, it was a well-oiled machine. And so one of the things that I think, even the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not, Catholic nuns. But the nuns, it's interesting because if you did some polling, I'd be interested to know how they engage with media that does have spiritual content, or do they even see it as spiritual content? Because having lived up in the Pacific Northwest, I think they have the highest concentration of nuns in the country. And one of the things that I was noticing is I still had, because I'm a religious historian, people often are like, oh, so let me talk to you about this. And okay, so you're a nun, but you're engaging with, and you're, like the divine or like a God or living my life, no, but I love to borrow from Vedic tradition because I love this quote and I love this and that. Like, how do you poll for it? How do you understand, like, you've done away, like, you're fine in an atheistic worldview, but you're still borrowing from all of this and in ways that you look to comfort yourself, in ways that you look to understand the world. I don't know how to deal with that. It's a real...
Like people who take things out of great literature and say,
yes,
this is a tradition that many people subscribe to. You can say a cultural influence, and there are people who say, well, there's some moral teachings in these different things, and the person might say, well, I'm not really following Confucius or Lao Tzu or any of these.
yes.
But this passage isn't bad.
And that's what's so hard to untangle is, like, what's your motivation as you're reading it? And just because you say you don't believe in a deity and you operate in an atheistic worldview doesn't mean that you don't take some spiritual meaning from those things, and then it becomes really hard to untangle. And that's, I think, what this polling shows. You just have to be really careful with how you frame that, and I don't know how to untangle it. Yes?
You made a great point, especially the lower attendance and also the media, and how the religious groups and general public interact with the media. And I just did some search online, and thank you, Greg, for the great recommendation of the books. I already ordered those books. And
Yes, great.
and also, I just did some research online because recently some senior members of the family asked me to download those churches' apps for them so they can watch Sunday services online. So I did a little search, and you will be really surprised at the streaming services recording Sunday masses and Christian churches. And you can even find a question on Google, best online churches. Because it counts as attendance if I watch church masses online. So questions like that, I think that ties into the question of do they count? So does that count as attendance?
Right.
Yeah,
And
to the church.
I think this is where my thinking has gone on both of these. Are great questions, so thank you so much. Because I've been thinking a lot about this for years now, but you have the Chautauquas, and that's kind of a whole new way of doing it. Then you have the radio, a whole new medium. You have televangelists, a whole new medium. And just in the last 35 years, you've moved everything online. So there's this whole new medium. What does interaction look like there? I don't think participation in a church service, at least the way it's often framed, catches the ways that people are engaging with that content. And in a way, it abstracts that content even one level further, because I don't know if you're watching Catholic Mass because you're a religious historian and you have no spiritual investment in it, but I'm taking notes and I'm doing research, versus somebody who's there for the spiritual experience. If you were in a church service and I show up and I've never been there before and I'm sitting next to you in the pew, you might ask me, like, are you new here? Would you like me to tell you how to... No, I'm a religious historian. I'm just here to observe. But you're not getting any of that context with an app where everybody's just kind of downloading it and then engaging. So I think that switch into this newest medium really is kind of causing a lot of problems in understanding. And it's also been accompanied by people engaging spiritual content under atheistic forms that they're bringing in and stuff, and it's just hard to parse out. Boyce, I'm sorry I forgot you earlier.
There's a term that keeps coming to mind to me when I think of religious services or my family that you have to use, and that's community. And in the past, people went to church to have that community. They went to a physical building in order to meet other people. Even when we had televangelists, we could watch it online, listen to it on the radio. There was not engagement. But now, last 10, 15 years, you can engage with the community without leaving your house.
Right.
And I think that's a bigger hurdle to, I mean, you're talking about all the complications, but that's another more recent one that I'm not sure is easily captured.
And I wonder, as you increasingly divorce from a local context, and it's not like you couldn't do that even in 1935 with Charles Coughlin and listening to the radio, and you're in your little house and you're like, well, I'm not going to go do anything. I'm just going to become more and more fascist with Father Coughlin here, and just divorce myself from this local context into this national context of other people that follow Coughlin. And people did that, but I think with the internet and with the ability to engage in a community pretty thoroughly online in your house, you can find a bunch of people that say the earth is flat, and that's your whole community. So that's not only changed religion and how we engage it, but it's changed everything. And with that kind of change, these older markers of, do you go to church once a week or something, they don't seem to resonate anymore. I don't know how to get those back, but I think the more I research this topic, I stopped my research in 2000 because I'm like, well, I don't want to figure out how to get people's IP addresses and figure out how they're engaging with this content, how many apps got downloaded, and is it because they downloaded it on their phone and their computer and whatever else, and there are 3 downloads, but I should only count them as 1, Like, so I do have to say, I kind of like, oh, that's a lot of work, and I didn't jump into it. But I think that's where everything's going, and that's going to be how we figure out this kind of next engagement. I will say, just anecdotally, I taught a class on the occult last semester, and it was completely full, and I think it even had it was capped even beyond full. And then this semester I'm teaching a class on critical thinking and cults. I put cults just to draw people in, new religious movements. But that also was, I think it was supposed to cap at 25 and it's at 29. Like, there's a lot of interest, and just walking around the world as a religious historian, people are like, oh, explain to me this. But it's not, they want to engage with me, because if I was a preacher walking around, I think they'd be like, no way am I talking to that guy. Like, he's going to try to pull me in. There's I want to know, but I don't want the community. Like, the community feels weighty. So, yeah, things have abstracted more, and I don't quite know how to process that in my own research.
Just the question that you ask anymore is going to be complicated. I mean, if you ask someone, do you go to school? And they can say yes, and you go, where? Well, I get up and I put my computer on, and I'm in school now.
Right. We've got that.
It's online.
And working at FHSU Online, I was constantly trying to think of ways to create more community that was meaningful for online students. And I think a lot of my colleagues in different religious and spiritual kind of businesses are thinking along those same lines. Like, how do we make this meaningful for people coming in through that medium?
That's the business end. I'm just thinking of chat groups, or you just find like-minded people, and there it is.
And YouTube algorithm will help you a lot of that. You just do one search and you'll say, here, you like that? Here's a whole lot more of it.
But then always the tricky part is you want to keep your customers, right? You want to retain. So how do you make it meaningful? That's tricky, David.
Because I was kind of thinking about that idea, thinking of this in terms of markets, right? And of course, if you're just talking a market, if I sell you a product and you're happy with the product and the product lasts, that's great, but then I can't sell you more.
Right.
So there's this motivation like, oh, but that was last year's model. You need the new one. So my job is to continue to convince you that your life is awful and you now need my new product. I'm thinking about that in terms of explaining, like, the way things are is rotten, and so you need my new religion.
Right. Yes, and I have to update it.
They have to just continuously update it.
And there are, the new religious movements we're looking at do that, but the older kind of more traditional, I don't know how to even put that properly, but those movements sell a different product, which is we have not changed. In a world where everything changes, we are solid and not changing, and that also has a market share to it as well. So yeah, it's interesting to watch how both of those kind of play out.
There's this constant pressure to try to say that the status quo is rotten.
Right. Yeah. And rotten because you need something new, or rotten because we need to return to the old. Yeah.
I want to bring this aspect to David's point that also a lot of churches are treating religion as entertainment. They add a lot of elements of entertainment into their services, so people will keep coming back. So it's not really just a product, but it's an atmosphere, an experience, entertainment. If we look at from those perspectives, we probably will find more to analyze. Maybe meanings and the force and the tug of war, why people come back, why people are leaving.
And I'll weigh in just really quickly to that point, which that's why I like Selling God and why we decided to look at it again, because constantly getting questions of how could evangelicals elect somebody like President Donald Trump, who has been divorced several times and womanizes, and well, if you think about it as entertainment, that's a whole different way of looking at it than piety, and it seems to explain far more at the political moment than say Duthat and his heresy kind of thing. I think entertainment and market share, at least for me, has a lot more explaining power. Kevin, I'm
time
sorry.
for one more question.
Okay, yeah. It's you.
Just a tiny comment. Tons of literature recently about religion and social capital.
Yeah.
When we're talking about markets, it's not just financialized. It's often financialized, but all of these excrescences of today's social media, social networking, social belonging, divorced from institutionalization, points ever more toward the power of the market for social capital. It can be financialized.
And in an attention economy, you need that. So.
Greg, just real quick.
Oh yes, Chris.
Do you think that the phenomena that you discussed today is distinct to the United States, or are we seeing it in other developed democracies?
I think it's throughout, and it's fascinating to watch how that plays out in the Philippines, in Brazil, in Argentina, France, Germany, Italy. So I think the religious marketplace in the United States is just one, but it's a nice window into a much larger religious marketplace and spiritual and political attention economy in the whole world. There's lessons there that I think apply far more broadly.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Atkins for
Thank you.
trying to look at history in the current moment of American politics. The last thing I want to do is invite you to make a note in your calendar that next week we will be having our last Times Talk of the year. It's called Legal Deserts, Understanding and Addressing the Rural Attorney Shortage in Kansas. This is an incredibly important topic because so many of our young people are leaving the smaller communities in western Kansas, and even if they go to law school, many of them are not really coming back, and certainly not with the attorneys that maybe they do get don't have a sense of what they're preserving and protecting legally in these places. So this is of vital importance, not just in terms of legal questions, but in terms of where some jobs could be for some of our graduates. And we would love that if you could let graduates or students that you have who are headed to or considering law school, please aim them at this Times Talk, because we're going to be talking about something that could be very, very relevant to their future and very relevant to the communities that they come from. So thank you very much for your attendance, and we would love to see you next week on Wednesday, same time, 11:30 to 12:30.
Thank you all for coming.